Good morning, everyone, and welcome wherever you are in the world. I suppose I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Catherine Hilst. I am the voice in the background, and I am the IS-BAO Operations Manager, and I'll be your host today for this IBAC SafetyNet presented by MedAire and Bombardier, building operational resiliency and continuity in your operation. I have a couple of few housekeeping items before we introduce our presenters today. Just due to the size of the group, everyone is on mute and you'll stay on mute. However, you do have the capability of asking questions, and that would be on the bottom of your control panel. There's a little questions drop down. You can just type in there anything you would like throughout the presentation, and we'll address them at some point during the presentation. If they are on topic during the presentation, we'll bring them up. Otherwise, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. This is the first in a two-part series presented by MedAire, and this topic today is building operational resiliency and continuity in your operation. Just the reality that international travel today comes with new risks and unexpected challenges that the global pandemic and widespread political unrest have accentuated. We're going to discuss today's threats to passenger and crew security, how these threats can be managed and mitigated, and the panel will share de-identified events and scenarios, and we will have time at the end for questions. Our presenters today, John Cawthon, Senior Director, Aviation Maritime from MedAire. He joined MedAire in 2018 as the Security Director, Aviation and Maritime. He leads a 24/7 security operation split between the United States and the United Arab Emirates centers. His team delivers critical threat intelligence and assistance to aviation industry stakeholders on a global basis. As a U.S. Navy veteran, John has over 20 years of industry experience in security, risk management, aviation, military, and local police. In addition, he taught history for the U.S. Naval Academy and has both FAA remote pilot certificate, commercial helicopter, and airplane pilot licenses. Since 2019, he's been a member of the National Business Aviation Association Security Council, providing security guidance and risk management best practices to the organization's member base through briefings and various organizational engagements. He also represents MedAire as a member of the U.S. Transportation Security Administration's Aviation Domain Intelligence Integration Cell. Etienne Cote is the Chief Pilot, Demonstration Flight Operations, Air Safety Investigator with Bombardier. And he started with Bombardier in 2007 as an instructor pilot, and also served as a customer liaison pilot for 7 years, and later as a production test pilot. He more recently joined the Bombardier's demonstration group in early 2020 and was named Chief Pilot, Demonstration Flight Operations in January 2023, just recently. Congratulations. Etienne has always been an advocate for better understanding and inclusion of human factors with regards to cockpit operation and procedure design. As such, he's led Bombardier's checklist initiative in an effort to align the procedure design with the challenges and realities faced by business aircraft pilots in live operations. He's also completed the aircraft accident investigator training with the NTSB and supports the Bombardier Air Safety Investigation Office as an auxiliary investigator. Etienne is also actively involved in Bombardier's annual safety stand down. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate you taking your time to do this and to have this conversation about operational resiliency. And so with that, I will hand it over to you.
To be here.
Well, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Well, I'll go ahead and kick off, and thanks for that great introduction. So MedAire, just very quickly, is an international organization. We're part of the International SOS group of companies. And just a quick visual representation of some of our centers spread across the globe here that support our members, whether you're in the Americas, Africa, or Asia. There's always somebody to reach out to. And as noted, we've got a 24/7 operation to help with some of those security and threat intelligence queries that may arise during some of your operations. Next slide, please. And just another data point here. MedAire, as many of you probably are aware, has been in the industry in one way or the other for over 35 years, and we represent over 4,500 different aircraft globally, as well as aviation interests on the Part 121 and 135 side. We also have a maritime business where we're doing a very similar service offering. And again, this is just one component of it. We're an integrated medical and security company, and very happy to be here today. Thank you. Next slide.
Well, hello. Thanks for the introduction again. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you named it, I recently been named as the chief of the demonstration flight operation. Bombardier is known as a manufacturer, an OEM, and we're happy to be also deeply involved in safety initiatives such as Safety Stand Down. We've used also in our own practice the number of contractors, a number of partners into making sure our operation is a safe one, a safe and secure one, MedAire being one of them. And happy to be here to present some of the, I guess, the more operational details surrounding some of the security aspect that we face on a daily basis and safety aspect that we face on a daily basis. So what we have at Bombardier flight operation is the operational branch of the OEM. So the OEM being a manufacturer, not necessarily a full-blown operation as you'd normally understand it. We have a number of pilots, number of people working to make sure that the aircraft is certifiable, but the operational branch of it that does customer-like operation is a very small one, and that's the one that I spearhead at the moment. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Etienne. So today we're going to talk through some global threats that we're seeing, some of the risks that are out there, and we'll contextualize it around some of those operational aspects that Etienne mentioned here. And I think this will be quite useful because as we've seen coming out of the pandemic, the world has changed in a great deal of many ways. So we're now experiencing various economic issues from high inflation, domestic political tensions, as well as increasing geopolitical tensions, notably in Eastern Europe. We're seeing this impact flight operations from a three-dimensional airspace perspective, as well as what's happening on the ground. So no area of the globe is spared. Even those traditional low-risk environments like North America and even Western Europe are starting to experience unrest, sometimes tied to environmental movements, other domestic political issues, and even the larger global currents. So these are challenges that are ultimately going to affect aviation operations no matter where you are in the world. And those are some of the issues that we'll touch on today. So Etienne, maybe let me turn it over to you and see if there's any information that you want to share in that regard, because that's certainly what we're seeing from a MedAire perspective if you want to contextualize it globally.
Definitely, definitely, and I think the last couple of years have been very challenging into making sure that we have a safe and secure operation throughout the globe. So Bombardier Flight Operations covers a variety of missions, right? So we do for exec transport, we support our sales, we go to various trade shows, and these are obviously around the globe. And we also support sometimes stranded customers that are in need to just to support because of an AOG situation and things like that. So we've been facing, I guess, an interesting amount of challenges in specific regions. You mentioned places like Germany, like Europe. Germany recently, we have had an impact on some of our trips just because of the unrest in Germany with the closure of airport operations due to strikes and things like that. So it's been interesting to try to get the intel ahead of time to try to make sure that our operation is continuous as much and keep on focusing on the mission. But it's been challenging in the places that we've never seen challenges before. So as you pointed out, North America, not so much, but Western Europe, definitely. Some places in the Middle East that used to be also fairly easy to operate in and out of are being challenged just because of things that are happening around in that area. Asia Pacific remains problematic for sure. And we recently did a tour in Asia Pacific, and I guess the unrest with China, the recent unrest with China, adds an additional layer to consider when we go there. So I guess the gathering and intel is pivotal to make sure that you got successful operation all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And MedAire would concur. I mean, that proactive approach, ensuring that you've got either internal capabilities, external, or a combination of both to be able to gather that crucial information to be able to build good situational awareness. Because as you mentioned at the end, no matter where you're going today in the world, even though those historically secure and stable locations, you can run the risk of running into a challenge that you may not have seen two or even 3 years ago. So there's no doubt about that. So no, it'll be an interesting conversation, I think, today. So next slide, please, Catherine. So maybe just from my perspective, a quick rundown, as we've kind of already teed up here from a global perspective. If we look at just the Americas, even in the US and Canada, for example, coming out of the pandemic and even during the pandemic, we saw a lot of domestic turmoil, right? Sometimes associated with the pandemic incidentally or directly. But to be sure, that domestic unrest manifested in civil unrest across a number of different cities, notably in the United States. So historically safe locations trying to operate into, for example, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, West Coast major urban areas, even the Eastern Seaboard, as well as Chicago and other locations, these became increasingly volatile and violent. And so these are challenges that we're still seeing in the United States. We even saw this across the northern border in Canada with some of the pandemic-related issues with truckers blocking access to major entry and exit points from a trade perspective through ports of entry. So, North America itself wasn't immune. If you look at Latin America, I think this is also an interesting one. I'd be very curious to get your view on this, Etienne. Mexico has been, I think, depending on, of course, where you're going, a challenging location for a long, long time. But you could make the argument that even the narco-terrorism that is increasing, or at least seems to be increasing, could have a significant impact on aviation operations. So depending on those areas where there is cartel activity, and a lot of these cartels, to be perfectly honest, are as well armed and trained as some of the law enforcement and military providers in that particular area. This can present a particular hazard not only for overflight but on the ground. And as we saw just less than a month ago, essentially an urban war break out between cartels and government forces, with incidental fire impacting an Aeromexico flight in Culiacan as an example. So Etienne, have you been seeing any of these challenges in Latin America as there's been this shift domestically as well as geopolitically in some of those locations?
Definitely, John. You talked about Mexico, and this has been a little bit more in the past, but still in the recent past, where we've had to dispatch an investigation team into Mexico unfortunately, to investigate an incident. And that location that we had to go was deep into cartel country. So it's so how do you plan for this? How do you make sure that, yes, there is a job, there's a mission to do to support the authorities in investigating something, but there's also how do you do it safely? How do you make sure that your people are not going to be impacted by the civil unrest that's happening in the area? And it is a danger zone. So we would normally not go at all. But sometimes the nature of the work that we have to perform is kind of forcing us that way. So we did partner up with MedAire, I believe, on that one, and to try to see, okay, well, we're going to need support over there. So the security details and the information about who's going to be your security, or what's their background, how do you recognize them, what kind of vehicle are they going to support us continuously, what is their role, is there anything that we need to do, but also to the extent that we have to go is also into tracking of the crew. So installing special softwares on our electronic devices, on our phones, to be able to communicate more directly, having a sat phone and things like that. So these were all things that we would normally not have considered in the past, but we had to because of the places that we had to go and the mission that we had to fulfill. You talked about other places in Latin America. So Peru and what's going on in Peru has also directed some of our choices in operating in the area. So we do have on a regular basis to go in Latin America to support our sales. And Peru has traditionally been a place where we considered relatively safe to operate in and out of Lima, and it was fairly easy. But the last few months have been putting a little bit of a different twist to it. So, and there's not a lot of places that you can operate easily, or you can't really change your plan in the air all the time, right? So you need permits, you need the different countries don't always cooperate as much as you'd like to. So sometimes you do have to make some interesting choices. So definitely we've avoided, based on what's going on, certain areas, but we still need to access the area. So how do we do it safely? And so we risk mitigate, and we look into from the partners into securing places where we can safely go. In this case, we just chose not to go to Peru and choose another place to go instead. We've made more use of Brazil and Argentina in the area, and even Colombia, to kind of avoid having to go into that location. But yeah, definitely the threat is definitely on the rise in some of these areas that we traditionally didn't have a problem to operate before.
Yeah, and it's really been interesting from our perspective to see that, and it's great to kind of hear your, on the ground or even in the air perspective to kind of bolster what we're seeing from an intel perspective. But Lima's a great example, right? I mean, you're starting to see this domestic and political unrest manifest in the blockages of major roadways as well as public transportation into and out of airports, the shutting down of airports, the occupying of those terminals. It's become an area that I think is central to some of these protest movements because it's high profile, it's high impact. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see some of this impact significantly more areas of Latin America, because we're certainly seeing, if you will, a more aggressive leftward lurch in political parties and affiliations down there with the elections recently in, say, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, as well as Brazil. So I think time is going to tell what ultimately happens, but it appears that the early indications are that you're probably going to see increasing levels of unrest. And then if you look at this from a geopolitical perspective as well as economic, shortages as well as higher inflation pressures, it's probably not going to be a surprise to anybody that you need to take as much of a proactive approach as you mentioned here. Understand what your sources are, understand what's happening on the ground, because ultimately you're going to end up in an airport location. And as you mentioned, it's very, very difficult to make those last minute changes because there's so much preparation required. So I think it's absolutely critical that you identify those challenges as far in advance as possible, make appropriate assumptions, and then implement those risk mitigation strategies so that you can hopefully safely and securely operate into these locations, because clearly there's going to be a business interest, and no doubt Bombardier has those across the globe. So let me shift real quick here to the opposite side of the world. I just saw today, and this is an interesting one. It'll be at the end, your perspective in flying into this part of the world. Probably one of the major things that we're seeing on the minds of people is the continued war in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine. The impacts that has on overflight, basically a carte blanche restriction of being able to fly efficient routes from Europe into the Middle East and elsewhere. This is likely going to be a continuing issue, and we've seen some exacerbation certainly over the weekend and prior to last week. And if we look at this more from a geopolitical perspective, I think time again will tell how this manifests. But right now, the early indications are that things are going in a negative direction. So, for example, we've seen that China, as a major supporter of the Russian regime, is in active discussions as to whether or not they're going to be supporting the war with material weapon systems that could potentially inflame the situation or increase the longevity of it. I also just saw recently that Vladimir Putin has suspended the nuclear arms treaty between the United States and Russia. This could be a significant escalatory issue in that area. And so from your perspective, what is Bombardier doing, and how are you all looking at this from a proactive perspective? And what are you doing to modify your operations to account for the challenges now and the challenges in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great that you mentioned it, because unfortunately, where this is happening is cutting. Well, you'd cut a lot of time if you could access the airspace right now for a lot of the missions that we have to carry, because we regularly go North America to Asia. You'd like to go to access India, Australia. You'd like to access the Middle East. And sometimes, Dubai, for example, being a pretty central hub in business aviation as well as for commercial airlines, when you need to go from Dubai to Europe or even Dubai to North America, then you'd slice through that airspace sometimes. You'd have choice of routes, but you have to work with your flight plan provider, for example, because the permits for the number of countries that you have to go through is going to be sometimes difficult to arrange. So you can't be last minute about things. You have to really be proactive and trying to prepare this ahead of time, but also the dynamicity of the situation around Ukraine and Russia makes that block of aerospace a very dynamic one as well. So so someday for weeks it could be safe, it could be okay to operate on the south, over Turkey and kind of go in that area to get across in Europe. But some of the days, and maybe soon enough, it might not be so safe to go there. There's a number of things like GPS jamming that's happening also in that area of the world. So you have to have kind of the knowledge and kind of try to risk mitigate based on, okay, today we need to really make up some time because of crew duty day. Do we accept a routing that's going to get us over Iraq, Turkey to go to Europe, or do we go kind of what I call the southern route through Egypt and try to go angle ourselves north through Europe afterwards, which adds time, which adds operating costs, and shortens our available duty day, I guess, to a certain extent. So you need to balance some of these operational choice with the safety and security reality out there. So like last week, we had to make a choice like that, and we analyzed based on the aircraft equipment, are we okay? Should we have, let's say, a GPS jamming for an hour in this particular area? Are we okay to operate? Can we operate? Can we navigate within the boundaries that we have to navigate so that nobody sees us as a threat because we're off course type thing? And so the answer that we had at the time became a yes. We have the ability with this aircraft to be able to do this even without GPS. Our accuracy is going to be precise enough. So that became an acceptable risk from that perspective. But there's also let's mitigate a few things. Let's make sure that we operate, in this time of the day that we maximize that we limit the passenger exposure and so on and so forth. So we try to do this on ferry flights, for example. If we're not too sure about an area or a region, we're trying to make sure that we can reduce the exposure to some of our potential passengers or executives. As we determine and get better intel over time. And I think the key point is also connectivity. In our case, we were lucky enough to be connected pretty much all the time in flight through our, through the internet system availability that we have on board, which becomes key into maintaining that intel and awareness level to its highest degree. So we can potentially get to know as we're on the fly if something is changing, and maybe that's going to make us take a different decision, stop somewhere else, or redirect ourselves on a different route. So it's very interesting, very dynamic for sure, and it's always a question of risk mitigation. Do you have the ability to go one way, or is it better to go the other way?
Yeah, and you bring up a great point, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to make some decisions here, and it's based on that risk analysis and having that good quality information, whether it's internal, external, or a combination of both. I think is extraordinarily important because you identify in that really key part of the world is what route do you take? How do you safely get through this location? And frankly, things can change, last minute, if you will, on the ground that could impact that routing, could impact your safe diversions, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're taking that Red Sea route as an example, right, we've seen not only the jamming in the Eastern Mediterranean, but then as you penetrate into that location, the continued threat that Iranian proxies, for example, pose within the Red Sea, naval attacks from Iranian proxies in Yemen as well as Saudi Arabia, the Israelis in that location just over the weekend, for example, striking Damascus. It's a very, very dynamic location. And so understanding those challenges, understanding the various threats will hopefully help you be able to make the best decision possible. So you may choose, as you noted, to go the northern route there and penetrate through Iraq because it's a little bit more stable in that particular context, that time of day, that particular part of the week, or whatever the case may be. So it's interesting that you guys have been experiencing that and seeing that real world. And on the ground and in the air to be sure. What are some of the things that you're seeing as far as, and I'm curious about this because we, from the MedAire standpoint, we're looking at a lot of these weapon systems, whether they're, they span that entire spectrum, whether they're the really high-end weapon systems, surface-to-air missiles that we know, for example, are in Ukraine as well as parts of Syria, Lebanon, so on and so forth. But the more prolific or easier to use, acquire unguided munitions. For example, we've seen recently in the Democratic Republic of Congo on short final and takeoff, rocket propelled grenades, heavy machine guns. These pose a significant threat. What is Bombardier doing in that context when you're thinking about different weapon systems in those locations when you're having to make a decision and operate into that area?
Yeah, well, we have a security department that tries to make sure that we have good intel first as to should we even go there in the first place. And I think that given that we have civilian missions for our missions, civilian aircraft were to carry those missions at the demo department. We don't really have special equipment that we have access to inside the plane to kind of enhance our or protect ourselves from certain threats, like you mentioned, like self-launch rockets and things like that, like low altitude threats. So a lot of times what we'll try to do is mitigate by having a security detail look at these airports, look at we try to plan those well ahead of time. So to make sure that that our intel on the ground, we send boots on the ground as well through various subcontractors we have. To make sure that to get a good picture, to get is it even possible to operate there and under what circumstances, and is there any operational restrictions that we should impose on ourselves? A lot of times, some of these airports will choose not to stay there, so we might have to do a drop and go and then a pick and go. So we'll arrange not for the aircraft and crew to remain in a certain location, but we position ourselves to a safer location. So it really depends on the mission, but it's difficult. I would say a lot of times if we know that the threat is high enough, what we will do is we'll just simply delay that trip. We'll take a time to assess at a different time. And if it's really a critical mission, then we'll try to make sure we have security with us and ahead of us to get these. But we are still fairly exposed to a certain degree with some of these places that have higher security threats on the ground at low altitude.
Yeah, no doubt. And as you mentioned, right, I mean, that's a challenge with civil aviation, is we oftentimes don't have the access to some of these military grade countermeasures, right? Whether you see in military aircraft flare, chaff, things of that nature. So these are things that you really have to, I think, take a very proactive approach, understand what the threats are, know where those weapon systems are, know what altitude blocks are the most dangerous for you in that operating environment so that you can make good decisions in advance before you get into those locations. So it's really become part of that pre-flight planning process to understand the location, understand what your operational profile is, and ensure that you're implementing any risk mitigations to the maximum extent possible. So let me maybe shift a little bit here, because this is an interesting one. If we go back to maybe a lower risk environment, we know Middle East, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, these are very, very challenging locations and likely will continue to be so. But if we go back to Western and Central Europe, on the ground, you mentioned this has to be a part of that overall risk analysis process. And I think when we're looking on the ground, it's not just once you get to that airport environment, but it's once you leave the aircraft. It's if you're on an RON, you're in ground transportation, you're going to those various hotels, how long you're staying in that location. You have to think of everything from criminal activity. Are you a target? Are these things that you need to be aware of? All the way to even potentially, I'm going to return back to the FBO, and all of a sudden there's an environmental protest where there are people super gluing their hands to the tarmac. Maybe they're even vandalizing your aircraft. Has Bombardier experienced any of this? Because we're certainly seeing it in the news, right? And this is something that I don't think is going to go away. I think it's going to be exacerbated. So our aviation personnel, do you and your crews, for example, feel like you're a target just because of the nature of what you do in some of these locations?
Yeah, we two things on this. The first is being that we try to keep as lowest profile as we can. So obviously, sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not. Like if we go to a trade show and events, our presence is expected there, so sometimes it's difficult to hide, right? But I think that also, with what we have as Aircraft, usually a demonstrator, carries colors and carries branding, so so we are kind of easily identifiable once we are on the ground. So the way that we go about it is maintaining a low profile is what we try to desensitize information that relates to the tracking of the aircraft, right? So that we're not necessarily on public databases for tracking the aircraft through flight tracking software. We try to make sure that we keep the information of our whereabouts to as minimal as possible. So the FBO. To our service provider for flight planning and things like that, but also the hotel vetting, the crew transport is coordinated through usually our flight plan provider or through a known security agency that's going to support in that task. And we usually have these details communicated to us as a crew ahead of time. So when we pre-flight things, we usually have at least a couple of days a heads up for important missions. So we will look with our scheduling people, we'll review as a briefing, with the crew, the security details, the security threats, the assessment about not just the operational side, but what are the possible problems on the ground. Our security people are going to sometimes jump in and say, we are expecting this threat at this event or this location based on what we heard. I see the slide on the plane shaming right now, and business aviation is definitely I guess a target in that environment. And we will, for example, at events, we will make sure that our security people look ahead, even with the marketing people, which is interesting, because the marketing people will sometimes see and identify these people that are likely to disrupt an event. So they'll communicate details, and they will let us know, okay, well, we've identified these people are susceptible to be here. Here are the pictures. If you see them around the static, if you see them trying to interface with our personnel, then make sure you advise security and blah, 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 because we're going to try to make sure they don't disrupt the event. But what's also fairly interesting is this is where you see unique collaboration between OEMs. So you're at an event where you're normally competing for the same crowd, you're trying to sell a product and then so on and so forth. But you're also stuck with the same problem, is these people are attacking, let's say, your branding and what your business is, but they're also doing the same thing with your competitors. So between competitors, sometimes at trade shows, we will exchange security information about what are the possible disruptors. We will work with the event organizers to make sure that that we collectively identify these people if they're on site and are dealt with in a safe manner. So that they don't get to disrupt the event as per se. So and we also, as I said, make sure that our own people are aware of these people that are susceptible to be disruptors, and have a kind of an SOP onto what to do, who to contact, and so we try to work it out. But it's definitely dynamic for sure. And as far as normal planning outside of an event like this, it's really the collaboration between our planning team, our crew, and our providers that help us identify which hotel, which is in a safe environment. So hotel reviews is always there when we pick a hotel. It's not just based on the services we need and the location. It's also based on how safe this place has been vetted by some of our security teams or some of our third-party partners.
Yeah, no doubt. And you bring up an interesting one too. And this is a particularly unique challenge for the OEMs and the manufacturers, right? Clearly, if you're going to be representing the brand, you want to do that in as visible a way as possible. But then this creates a tension where now you're potentially creating a higher threat vector because of that notoriety or that desire to market the brand, get it out there, communicate it. So it's an interesting tension that you mentioned, and that component where marketing's having to play a role in this is, I think, quite important, right? To help identify some of those challenges, because you still want to be able to communicate the business, the brand, the value proposition, but simultaneously you've got to be able to protect the brand, you've got to be able to protect the people and the assets. Are you starting to see the need to, I suppose then, not be as visible, certainly when you leave the airport environment or a trade show or the static, Are you getting rid of the uniforms? Are you changing the uniforms to make them a little bit more subdued? What are some of those risk mitigations that you're implementing to ensure that you're finding that balance to be able to represent the brand appropriately, but simultaneously protect crew and assets?
Yeah, I have to say this is more something that we've started recently to discuss because of the rise in unrest throughout the globe. We've also been in position in the past where we've had our assets kind of targeted by security forces or extortionists to try to make sure that we have that we kind of secure the aircraft while we come up with money and then to try to relieve the aircraft out of a specific location. So I mean, we have seen this in the past. We were trying to prevent this by, as I said, advance intel, and sometimes we'll elect not to go into this particular location. But we have recently been discussing, okay, if we do end up in a place where we do have to where we would fear for potential retaliation or we'd be targeted, do we change in civilian clothes? Do we exit stage left, with a and then go magically in the building and come out the other end with a different car and the different security details and different clothes? We've started thinking about this, which is something that we did not contemplate as much in the past, or it was maybe a special event because we were going in a specific area once in a blue moon, once in every 2 years, let's say. But now it's starting to be addressed in our own discussions, and it will probably lead to change in the way that we assess certain locations and what we do to make ourselves more or less visible. As I said, we try to erase as much as possible an electronic signature to the aircraft. We provide our crews with training on a regular basis and security briefings as to what's the best practice in the places that we're looking at and that we're going to go to. But we also have to try to prepare for heightening this to another level and taking different measures, such as, yes, uniform change and try to blend with the crowd, I guess, to a certain degree, so that we're not as visible.
Yeah, no doubt, which of course is important once you get in, and it's going to be unique to every situation, right? Once you get into that city center and you're traveling, last thing you probably want to do anyway is, and I know this has been around for quite some time, but any sort of indication that you might be a crew, which ultimately would make you a target. So how do you ensure that you're managing the uniform, even the luggage and the bag tags, to ensure that you're remaining as incognito as possible? But it certainly is a challenge, and I would say it also probably extends to some of our friends on the 135 or the charter and fractional, because those brands and those uniforms are important as well because it represents the company as they're going out and about and servicing their clients. So no question about it. It's an interesting challenge, to be sure. So I know we're running up against the clock here. Why don't we move to the next slide, Catherine, if you don't mind, and let's maybe look ahead a little bit. We put up just a couple of locations here just to try to give a little bit of a sampling across the globe. One area we didn't really talk too much about is, sub-Saharan Africa as an example. Very, very politically volatile location, a lot of domestic political risk. We've seen a number of recent coups, for example, and this has resulted in instability on the ground, challenges from an overflight perspective, as well as getting to that location. Iraq, as we kind of touched on, continues to be a bit of a hotspot, and this is primarily going to impact overflight. But certainly, if you've got interest in those locations, like Baghdad or Mosul or whatever the case may be, you've got to be aware that it's still a very, very volatile location. Nigeria, they're in Western Africa. This is a major entry pot, especially for the oil and gas business. A lot of challenges in that location. We're seeing quite a bit of unrest continue between the south and the north. And then we've already talked a little bit about Ukraine. One thing that has come up over the weekend and has, I think, and is going in an interesting direction that I want to bring up that we didn't have time to put on this slide, and I'll be curious your thoughts on this, Etienne, is what's happening in East Asia, notably between the U.S. and China. So if we look at this purely from a geopolitical perspective, and we even rewind the tape a little bit, if you will, there's been increasing tensions between the U.S. and China. And in many regards, there's been a certain level of aggressiveness or escalation that I think is going to impact operations in that location. And what I mean by that is if you go back to what China is now doing with regard to or considering what they may be doing with helping or assisting Russia, coming out of the recent Munich conference between the United States and China, for example, as soon as that was over, the foreign minister Wang Xi traveled to Moscow. This is creating a potential rift with the United States, et cetera, et cetera. Two major powers in the area. And as we saw, again, if we rewind that tape, what happened when the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, traveled to Taiwan, there's some discussion of U.S. military senior level individuals traveling to Taiwan as well. This could create significant issues with airspace access, overflight, and also just general tensions in the area that are going to impact aviation operations. And incidentally, will North Korea decide to continue to misbehave and start to launch continued launches of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles into major commercial routes in Northeast Asia? So it's a really interesting region right now for some of the developments. I think it's too early to say what's eventually going to play out. Diplomatically, this may be a game of cat and mouse, but I think it's something definitely to keep an eye on. And I'm curious your thoughts on this and what Bombardier is seeing in such an important region, not only from an overflight perspective, but also from a business standpoint.
Yeah, a great point because you just named the two things that are basically a thorn in our operational mindset, right? So we have tremendous business potential in that area, and in particular in China itself. But we also have a restriction that comes with, we can't overfly a certain piece of airspace just north of China. We can't overfly really China itself for the most part. So it becomes really difficult to operate. You kind of have to circumnavigate a lot of things. But so for the longest time, China was kind of not open for business during the pandemic days, right? Now, recently, this recent openness that they've had for business got us to look into operating inside of China again. So Hong Kong was something that we were still operating in and out of on a regular basis. But getting deeper into mainland China was pretty much impossible from a visa standpoint. There was a number of things that were preventing us, and we were kind of happy to let it play out for a while because of the pandemic aspect and the security. Just the nature of going in and out of China is a little bit, puts a lot of our crews uneasy, I guess. A lot of uncertainties, and it's been a while since we had to operate there. So looking into operating there was looking that the next few weeks and months it was going to be possible. Now with the recent, I guess I'll call it discussion, for lack of a better term, between the U.S. and China, it's become problematic again. So we are putting probably a question mark. We're being very cautious. We're taking baby steps. We would probably have a lot of our salespeople that would love to for us to start operating back in the area. But again, we have to make sure we proceed with caution, and that we also monitor where we go before getting into China, where we go after going into China, because that also is becoming a restriction, as you put, between Taipei and between Taiwan and China. You can't really go from one place to the other without transiting somewhere else first. They're not really going to let you play that game. So it brings a lot of restrictions. Again, the intel piece is pivotal to this. The communication between our partners is pivotal to this. But we need to have what one of my peers would call the warm and fuzzy. We need to be able to, before we take a decision to operate there, to have all these risk mitigations into place and making sure we understand how to get out. What's the out plan? What's the escape plan if we need one? Who's going to be our partners, or who are the boots on the ground to help us? And that right now is still unclear.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, I appreciate that, Etienne, and your insights are really invaluable in this, given Bombardier's major footprint from an OEM perspective, the areas that you're going to, the types of flight operations that you have, especially from a demo perspective. It gives some unique insights into various parts of the world and brings a little bit more color to this academic exercise, right, when we're looking at these threats from a purely intelligence perspective. But I think some of the key takeaways, and certainly would reinforce what we've been telling our clients, is first and foremost, really do yourself a favor and understand what your resources are, either internally, externally, or a combination of both. Know where to go to get that good information, get that good intelligence, because as we've seen today, every part of the world is presenting unique challenges. And there's going to be different threat types. There's going to be different threat vectors that could impact your operations. And there's going to be a number of different risks that you have to account for and implement those controls and those mitigating measures so that you can hopefully still operate safely and securely. That's probably one of the key takeaways, no doubt about it, is really do a good job as part of that pre-flight planning process. Work with the various elements of your own organization and external providers to understand that, build the appropriate situational awareness. And it's not just the flight portion of it, right? It's not overflight. It's not just the airspace aspect. It's when you get on the ground as well. Understand what those threats are once you get to the airport. Safe transportation options. What are you going to do to maintain that crew continuity, safety, and security? When you get to the hotel, has it been vetted? Who's done that vetting? And what are options in the event that you need to leave that location quickly and get back to a safe location? Maybe there's multiple safe locations. And I also think you hit the nail on the head here, communications channels, right? Oftentimes we get so accustomed to utilizing our cell phones, but is that going to be in of itself enough? Is there a tie back to your corporate operations? Is there a tie back to your security department? Do you have a third party provider that can provide you good communications to understand that breaking news, so to speak, of maybe something occurring that you ought to be aware of so that you can make good decisions? And then, of course, with the challenges that we talked about with protest activity, environmental activism, so on and so forth, even trying to ensure that you understand what you represent from a threat perspective, just by virtue of your job and how you draw attention to yourself. And these are all important things to really understand as you bring this together to really build a comprehensive risk profile for each unique trip, right? There's no standard set here. It's going to depend on location. It's going to depend on what you're doing, where you're flying, and how you're operating. Now, that's really going to dictate the way that you should approach these from that perspective. So just again, last bit from me, and I think we probably need to go into questions here pretty soon, but we really appreciate everybody's time today. And I think those are some of those key takeaways. And if anything at all, just make sure you're really understanding what's happening around the globe as you travel, you fly, and you're on the ground working in those particular environments. So Etienne, anything else to add here before we transition over to questions today?
Maybe just one thing that relates to the pandemic, and I'll make it very quick. We had to operate internationally in a time where you needed tests left, right, and center, and so operationally it was becoming a challenge, just to make sure that our crews were staying safe, that we could monitor their health and well-being, and that we had plans, a mitigation plan should there be something else, but also just to make sure that we could on the fly meet the requirements of getting into a particular country. So we actually partnered up with Cedar Health, and we turned our planes and our crews into nurses and a medical lab. So we actually got the ability to run PCR tests on board the aircraft, and to make sure that our crews were trained appropriately to run. Yes, the PCR test was a naropharyngeal test, which is not exactly the most pleasant one, but we've given ourselves that ability to be self-sufficient, to be able to operate better in the world. And so there is creative solutions out there for both securities, but safety of the crew. And sometimes it goes through yourself, getting a little bit of a new qualification, I guess, for a crew member, and be able to run these tests in our own aircraft for ourselves, so that we can carry on our mission in the world. So that was interesting, and it's also a good way to be able to, you can cross-verify a test, so that you don't have to expose yourself to maybe questionable authorities on the ground that are gonna take you somewhere to run that test on you. So that's another operational insight that I just wanted to run, and a great way to keep on operating in a weird setting.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think the world's going to continue to be presenting us a host of challenges no matter where we go. I suspect that it's going to continue to be quite volatile. And so the best thing you can do is be as prepared as possible. And, that 1 ounce of preparedness goes a long, long way, as you mentioned here. So, Etienne, it's been great. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you today and getting your insights. into those real world operations and seeing what's happening out there today and how it may evolve down the future. So with that, Catherine, we can flip it back over to you. And if certainly there are any questions from the attendees or elsewhere, we're happy to answer them.
Awesome. Thank you guys both so much. Really fascinating information. And it seems like we could talk about this for hours. We don't have that kind of time. I do have one question here that asks if you have any recommendations on ways to minimize exposure to ADS-B tracking.
Yeah, this is a challenge. Etienne, do you want to take first crack at that?
Yeah, well, from an OEM perspective, it's we install and test and make sure the equipment is available. I think the only thing that I would recommend is on making sure that an aircraft is part of through the registry process is a private aircraft as much as possible. I don't think there's anything that you can specifically completely block the ADS-B tracking if somebody's got access to your X address and things like that. But these are usually available through the registry process. So if your registry is on the private list, then usually these details are not necessarily available that easily. So I think that would limit it, but that's kind of the extent of what we can do, I think, from my perspective anyway.
Yeah, this is a challenging one, and it kind of goes back to a little bit of what we were talking about with activists becoming more and more savvy, being able to track aircraft, understand what those operations look like. There's so many different services out there, even obscure ones. And of course, there was quite a bit of notoriety not too long ago with the university student who was tracking Elon Musk's aircraft, for example, and providing those updates on social media. ADS-B, because at the end of the day, frankly, it's just a radio signal, and anybody with a few dollars and a bit of know-how can create their own equipment to be able to track aircraft. This presents a very, very big challenge. So, Etienne, as you noted, I think some of the things that you can do is just to be absolutely certain, if it's within your ability to do so, whatever your organization allows you to do, get on those various programs. If it's in the U.S., for example, take advantage of the LAD program. If you can cycle your ICAO codes from time to time, as I know the FAA programs will allow you to do, certainly this is not going to potentially provide you that global coverage. There are probably other areas where you might be able to, what's the best way to put this? Obscure, if you will, the ownership or the tie back to the organization. And this would be an area where you might want to actually talk to your legal department, or maybe even a consultant who's aware of these types of processes, where you can potentially register your aircraft in a different legal jurisdiction, put it into various trusts. I know there's a process called a double blind trust, where you can essentially put it into different parts of ownership and registration, et cetera, et cetera. And this could help make it a little bit more challenging for somebody who's intent on understanding who owns that aircraft, who's operating, where it's going, et cetera, et cetera. Those are some strategies that could potentially be helpful. Certainly not an area where I'm an expert, but I know that there are some elements out there where you can take advantage of that. So, right. Interesting question.
Yeah. Also, just in looking at this post-COVID world, is there one security issue that you all see as being more prevalent than others post-pandemic?
I think that if I look at from an operational standpoint, there's two things that are always on my radar. One of them is my people on the aircraft, or whether it's crew or passengers, what to keep them safe. Where do I go to keep them safe, and kind of making sure that I always trace back any potential threats. So that's really I guess the highest thing on my radar. And the other thing is who my partners are in the areas of the world that I do not understand all that well, to help me take sound decisions and kind of de-risk as much as I can before dispatching an aircraft somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's trying to think as broadly as possible. And I know right now, honestly, the biggest challenge for anybody, because we're so busy, there's so many distractions, there's so much information out there, is trying to think tactically, operationally, and strategically. So it's that whole spectrum. And what I mean by that is Etienne has highlighted, right, there's a tactical element here. What do we need to do to take care of the immediate needs of the crew, the passengers, the asset as we're traveling? What does the operational profile look like? What are we doing in relationship to this location, these threats, the overall risk? And then strategically, as we talked a little bit about today, right, these are some of the longer term challenges that are manifesting out there that right now may or may not lead anywhere, right? But the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing in Eastern Europe, the tie-in to what's happening in China vis-a-vis the US and China, those relations, what might those mean if there's an escalation in that area? Additional closures of airspace, escalation in fighting, the longevity of that type of fighting, that's going to ultimately impact the ability for somebody to operate. So understanding what those challenges are is extraordinarily critical. The other one, and I think because of in light of the tragedy in southern Turkey and northern Syria with the recent earthquakes, I think we sometimes forget that we also need to account for those latent threats. And what I mean by that is when we're operating into a location that's actively a seismic zone, or there's volcanic activity, there's major storms that could impact you while you're on the ground or even your operations. Trying to think as far ahead as possible and map those out so that you understand what those locations are and what the various natural disaster threats are, because these could have huge impacts on you from an individualized standpoint as well as organizationally. So it's a lot to take in, but those are the types of things that you absolutely, from my perspective, really need to be thinking about. Tactical, operational, and strategic, and really do a good job of mapping all of those out, because there are so many different vectors out there to consider in this day and age, and I don't think it's going to be diminishing anytime soon.
It seems that this all comes back to what you're talking about on this slide and the next slide of maintaining and expanding your situational awareness through all of these resources. Really great sort of foundation for this. One question came in of if you're looking for data sources for updates to a mission, are there any free or low cost sources that you can trust, or is this something that you really need to, how do you find trustworthy sources? And, do you think they have to be paid for, or can you find some other things out there other than the news?
It's a good question. Oh, go ahead, Etienne.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting because I in my own notes for today, I had taken down that, from a info source is also something that you need to be considering. So for us, there's some more, I guess, long-term sources that or training events that like the IOC kind of conference that. And so, other NBA panels, for example, that we tend to send people out to get the kind of broader perspective of or bigger picture of what's going on in the world and what are the threats, what are the new things happening, and both in the operational world, but in the safe and security world as well. But the reputable source is something that you need to find, and reputable source is not so much what you find in the internet so it is existing on the internet. It is existing, but what is the source that makes it okay to listen to and okay to look at? And some will be free, some will be just shared. Like I believe in the safety standout principle of learn, apply, and share. It doesn't come necessarily with a price tag, but I understand that some of this intel is actually very hard to get by. And so sometimes maybe it's a punctual need that you have to go get some intel about a specific location, and sometimes that might be worth taking that the expense, because that if you're going to put the lives of crew and passengers or your own business branding at risk, then you have to understand what the risks are correctly, and to do that sometimes you do need to expense a little and go get that intel. But a reputable source, we use on a daily basis. I guess the ops group is one info that at very high level is going to provide us kind of an insight as to what's going on in the world operationally speaking, where the areas that of interest are. And we're going to look into this probably to help us dig deeper into our own traditional source of information, such as the flight plan providers have a great source. MedAire would be another one that we tap into, ISOS companies and services in general to make sure that we have all the right information to de-risk the operation as much as possible. But it's a challenge. But you got the long-term stuff that you can get yourself into, like the IBAC, the IOC kind of conference, the information that's out there by the various places, and the kind of the timely information that you're going to get from those providers, flight plan providers, MedAire services, and etc.
Yeah, and it's to me it comes down to, how much time do you have on your hand to sift through this? Because the biggest challenge today is just the volume, the sheer volume of information out there, and frankly, some of it can be rubbish. And so, how do you sift through this? How do you filter it? How do you find the right information? So, probably some of the best sources out there that are quote unquote free of charge. Etienne, you highlight a couple of trade association, industry resources that you can tap into, webinars, different speaking engagements, different trade shows. For a fairly minimal amount, can you attend these? Can you go to the different panels? So for Bombardier back in November held their annual safety stand down. We did a similar talk, right? So these are the types of events that you can go to, and it's about that information sharing. Etienne, you brought up earlier, right? Even among the OEMs, who's talking with whom, how is this information being transmitted, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one element within the industry itself. Tapping into, I would even say, reputable governmental sources, but you have to take this with a grain of salt. So for example, in the United States, through the State Department's Overseas Security Advisory Council, OSAC, if you become a member of that, there's a lot of great resources. You can get updated feeds. These come to you free of charge, and you're able to tap into that. Now, that's not with the aviation bent. So again, you've got to take that with a bit of grain of salt, right? They're talking about business interests, corporate level type stuff, as well as individual travelers. So you have to use a little bit of thinking in how you need to transform that for the aviation-centric approach to what you're looking at. I would also say, start to develop relationships with other governmental resources to include civil aviation regulators. For example, the FAA in the U.S. has a threat intel division that is happy to share various sources of information. The Transportation Security Administration, as an example, has some resources that you can tap into. So dive a little bit into that. Make sure you understand what those resources are as you access them. And then also just developing the network and the relationship and being able to reach out to folks that you trust, whether it's, fellow pilots, different operators, and even some of those handlers that are on the ground. So if you have a trusted handler in this location or this location, definitely recommend reaching out to them. And oftentimes they're a great source of information.
Fantastic. Thank you both. We're going to wrap this up, and you all have given some fantastic experiences and insights, and shared some stories that sort of highlight the importance of the expanded situational awareness and ability to be resilient in an ever-changing world. So any last thoughts before I wrap this up and send everyone on their days or nights?
Yeah. No, just want to thank IBAC. Thank you, Catherine, and team for helping to organize and host this. And Etienne, looking forward to meeting you in person in the future, and really appreciate the conversation today. And it was really enjoyable. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise, John. I really appreciate the conversation, the opportunity as well to share some of these adventures that we get into on an everyday basis, because they are in the end. Some of those are better than others, but and also thank all the participants, because showing interest into this means that you're showing interest in keep your operation safe and secure, which is great. So in the meantime, don't be afraid to learn, apply, and share, as we say in the stand down world of Bombardier. Thank you.
Yeah, you both
Thank you.
exemplify that. Thank you so much, Etienne, John. Thank you all for attending today. Really fascinating information, and I love the sharing of the various resources that might be out there, including the various events that happen. We've got MedAire and Bombardier to thank as well for supporting us. John, Etienne, appreciate your time. And this is part one. The next section of this will focus a little bit more on medical safety and things that are going on around the planet. We seem to have arrived in a strange new world in so many different ways. The date is to be determined, but probably in April, so keep an eye on the IBAC website for the webinars. And in the meantime, I want to thank you all for attending, and fly safe, and we'll see you all on the next IBAC SafetyNet webinar. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.